All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you all today to a conversation that will explore the impact that Pope John the 23rd and Pope John Paul II had within our church and around the world, and the ways that their exceptional leadership shaped the papacy to reflect and respond to the modern world. And I wish to first express my deep gratitude to our Vice President for Mission and Ministry, Father Kevin O'Brien, for his work to make today's conversation possible. In just a few moments, Kevin will moderate a discussion between two esteemed members of our community, two experts on the church, Gerard Mannion, who holds the Amaturo Chair in Catholic Studies here at Georgetown, and one of our world's most distinguished historians, University Professor John O'Malley. I look forward to introducing them all to you in just a moment. I'd also like to thank our Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs for their work to help bring us all together this afternoon. And finally, I wish to thank all of you, to express my gratitude to you for joining us today for what promises to be a wonderful conversation at an historic time for our church with the impending canonizations of two beloved and holy popes, John the 23rd and John Paul II. Today's gathering is one of the many ways that our community is coming together to celebrate this important occasion. As many of you know, we are working with the Archdiocese of Washington, the embassies of Italy, Poland, and Argentina, the Papal Nunciature, and WETA to host a concert on May 5th at Constitution Hall. This concert is entitled Peace Through Music in Our Age, and it will be led by Maestro Sir Gilbert Levine, who for many years collaborated with Pope John Paul II to spread a message of peace and understanding through music. Both the concert and this conversation we gather for today provide for our community the opportunity to pause, to reflect, and remember Popes John the 23rd and John Paul II and the impact that their work had within the church and around the world, an impact that shaped the church and the papacy that we know today. This is a church that more fully met and engaged the modern world through the Second Vatican Council, a church that grew more active in world affairs throughout the Cold War, and a church that came to play a deeper role in promoting reconciliation, dialogue, and understanding among the world's faiths. It's a privilege to be here with the three members of our community, Father Kevin O'Brien, Father John O'Malley, and Professor Gerard Mannion, who will provide for us deeper insight into these dynamics and to explore how the church's commitment to social justice, human dignity, and the common good, how these factors all help shape the church and the papacy for the 21st century. So let me introduce them to you. Dr. Gerard Mannion holds the Joseph and Winifred Amaturo Chair in Catholic Studies here at Georgetown. He's also a senior research fellow at our Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, where he co-directs the Church in the World program and focusing on the Vatican's role in world affairs. A widely published author on ecclesiology and public theology, his works include The Ratzinger Reader, Ecclesiology and Postmodernity, Questions for the Church in Our Times, and The Art of Magisterium, A Teaching Church That Learns, which is set to be published at the end of the month. Professor Mannion will be joined by Father John O'Malley, a professor in our Department of Theology. Father O'Malley has received Best Book Awards from many organizations, including the American Historical Association, the American Philosophical Society, the 16th Century Studies Conference. His works include The First Jesuits, which has now been translated in 10 languages, The Four Cultures of the West, What Really Happened at Vatican II, and Trent, What Happened at the Council. He's also served as president of both the Renaissance Society of America, the American Catholic Historic Association, and has held a wide range. I can keep going, John, if you want me to. Since I can't see you, I can only imagine how you are reacting to this. But we are honored to have both John and Gerard here, and to lead them will be Kevin O'Brien, who, as I mentioned earlier, serves as our vice president for mission and ministry. He's the author of The Ignatian Adventure, Experiencing the Spiritual Exercises of St. Ignatius in Daily Life, and teaches popular courses in our Department of Theology, which focus on the church in the 21st century. So please join me in welcoming our three panelists today.
Jack, thank you for that gracious introduction, and welcome all of you to Riggs Library, our historic library on campus. For those of you who have just arrived, we have a few seats up front, no extra charge if you'd like to sit up front, and some over here. So please make yourself comfortable. And a welcome to also those who will be viewing our discussion on the web through the Berkley Center. So thank you, John and Gerard, for being here today. Our theme is continuity and discontinuity in the papacy after Vatican II, to mark the canonizations of these two great popes, John the 23rd and Pope John Paul II. I thought we'd first just a little catechesis on canonization, what that means. And I'll first turn to John O'Malley to talk to us about canonization of popes. John is the author of a book on the history of the popes. We know in the early church, canonization was by popular acclaim. The martyrs were acclaimed as saints popularly. And it wasn't until the Middle Ages which we got some process to name a saint, as we're familiar with today. But in both cases, these popes, John the 23rd and John Paul II, they were, there was a bit of a special privilege given to both. Pope Benedict waived the 5-year waiting period for Pope John Paul II, and Pope Francis waived the second miracle for John the 23rd. But we have two popes being canonized. How common or rare is it that popes be canonized?
Okay, I'll answer that question, but I'd like to begin on a humorous note, if I may, because it might get serious as time goes on. I had the privilege of meeting John Paul II twice, but just met him, shook his hand. I never met John the 23rd, but in the summer of 1961, I happened to be in Rome, and just sort of out of the heavens fell tickets to a general audience with John the 23rd at Castel Gandolfo. I'll never forget the day. It was July the 22nd, Feast of St. Mary Magdalene. So we hopped on a bus and went out there, and great crowd and so forth. So the Pope, of course, always gave a little discourse. So he was reading it, and as he got towards the end, he said, "Now, I'd like to address a special word to the women pilgrims who are here today, how they should imitate the St. Mary Magdalene, her love for Christ, her love for penance, and her love for prayer, but not the other things she did." Well, as you can imagine, the place went crazy. So this whole thing about canonization of popes, the first 33 popes are by acclamation because they were considered to be martyrs, were popes. But the first pope to be canonized was Gregory VII in 1605. And the next pope to be canonized was Pius V, just about a century later. Then there are a couple of beatifications, but then we jump to the 20th century with the canonization of Pius X. And that sort of set off the process. When Second Vatican Council, when John the 23rd died, in the council there was a movement to just proclaim him a saint by acclamation. And Paul VI stepped in and said, no, we'll do a process and we'll pair him with Pope Pius XII. So the first pairing of John the 23rd was with Pius XII. Then some years later, when he was beatified, he was paired with Pius IX, and now he's paired with John Paul II. So that's his. But then once this began, I mean, since the Second Vatican Council, we have these two popes. We have a process for Paul VI. We had a process for Pius IX. Paul VI is servant of God, John Paul I is servant of God, and so forth. So it's accelerated.
Gerard, can I just ask you on that point? Is it, what impact is there for a church when we get into the habit of canonizing popes? That is, there gets to be an expectation that then popes will be canonized. Is that good for the church?
No. It's harder to fall out of that habit than it is to fall into it. And it's a little bit like, dare one say, on a university campus, when you start naming buildings after previous administrators, the habit is established and it goes on, and then it becomes expected. Under John Paul II, the canonization process became a veritable industry, and a costly industry for many religious orders who wanted their founders or foundress to be canonized. And John Paul II canonized nearly 500 saints, 483. That's almost as many as most of his predecessors put together. And there was an increasing trend during that pontificate sometimes to canonize people with undue haste. One could argue that the acclamation for John Paul II's canonization took place with rapid haste. Less than 2 months after his death, the cause for his canonization was announced. And of course, the crowd in St. Peter's Square were chanting for him to be made a saint soon after he died. But as John pointed out, the fathers at Vatican II were calling for a restoration of the ancient rite in the church of canonizing John the 23rd by acclamation. And Paul VI stepped in and said, well, let's just pause for a while and see what happens. And as John mentioned, there are several popes now in the pipeline. One has to ask, what is the real purpose behind canonization, and what is this saying about the church's process of sainthood, of having models of heroic virtue? It's not like, as one famous non-conformist historian once said to me, it's like a New Year's honours list. He saw the canonization process for the Catholic Church. It's not, and it shouldn't be. But if there's an expectation that a pope will automatically be pushed on the fast track towards sainthood, that could be not only difficult for the present-day pontiff, but it's also posing a lot of serious questions for later historians who want to assess that pontificate a little more judiciously.
I agree with you, and I think it's a very bad precedent. And I'm old-fashioned enough to believe that the reason people are canonized is because they're holy. And how do you know they're holy? Well, that's not easy to know. But I really feel that with John the 23rd, what we have, absolutely unique, is 10 diaries published now in Italy in excellent critical editions of his journal from the time he was a teenager until just about a month before he died. So this is diary entries, it's his reactions to different things, but also it's the journal of a soul. And I think in this case, we do have good evidence of a truly holy man. We know how he reacted to things and his relationship with the Lord and so forth. So that's unique for a pope. I mean, there's no other pope that has anything like that. Now, apparently there is a similar, smaller document for John Paul II somewhere in Poland, but it's not been published yet.
What if we could set each of these men in their historical moment? So, you know, were they popes necessary, needed, fitting for the moment in history? Let's start with John the 23rd. Can you situate John the 23rd in the historical moment where he was a man needed for the church at the time?
Well, yes. I mean, he lived in Italy in an extraordinary time for Italy and his own personal life. I mean, first of all, he was born in 1881. Well, the Papal States had just been seized 11 years earlier, or 21 years earlier. So, prisoner of the Vatican. So he grew up with this image. Then the modernist crisis in the early modern period, in which he and his Bishop Radini Tedeschi, were suspected of modernism. So he understood that. Then the First World War, he was a medical ordinary in which he had to deal with people who were not Catholics in suffering in the scene. Then he was exiled to Bulgaria. Well, he was the apostolic delegate to Bulgaria for 9 years, and to, he wasn't really exiled, I mean, it was just an assignment, but then to Turkey for 10 years, then to Second World War, where he had to deal with the whole problem of Jewish refugees and other problems with the Nazis and so forth. And the problems of Europe after the Second World War, the emergence of Christian democracy. So it was what seems to me, what he learned by experience was the goodness of people across confessional divides and across religious faith divides, and an optimism and a willingness to take reality as it is, cooperate with it, instead of the alienation of the church from the modern world that had taken place in the 19th century. And then John Paul II, very different history. Poland, totally Catholic and more Catholic because of the resistance to the Nazis and then the long resistance to the communist regime. And so a situation of siege, really, and necessity for the church to have a united front. And so the enemy on the one hand was communism, and then once that fell, the enemy was Western consumerism, Western secularism, and so forth. So two very different histories, two very different moments in the way they reacted to moments. Gerard?
Gerard, do you want to add, reflect on their historical moment?
Yes, I guess these are the two popes who, further down the line, people will be looking at to judge. One or both of them will be judged by history to have had the greatest impact upon the church in the modern papacy. And for John Paul II, going into the postmodern era as well. They were only born a generation apart, but in many ways they were born a complete world apart. Some similarities in their backgrounds, that they both lived during monumental periods of history and at the crossroads of history. Both of them know what it's like from their personal experience to live under a dictatorship. But what they did with that experience was quite different. John Paul II never lived under democracy except in his younger days. He, as with the church in Poland at the time and in much of Eastern Europe where Catholics were, he ended up being mimetic towards the authoritarian structures that people in Poland were resisting. John the 23rd took his own experience of living under a dictatorship and used that to forge a radical openness towards people of all faiths and people of no faith, and to keep the emphasis upon dialogue and what people share in common. They both both of them were deeply spiritual people, and there's testimony throughout their various writings and their biographies to their deep spirituality. But they were very different in temperament as well. John the 23rd was the son of peasants, came from a mountain village in northern Italy, and he became a historian. And that keen sense of history made him what he was in terms of being a churchman, in terms of being the reforming pope that he became. John the 23rd, John Paul II rather, was a philosopher, a poet, an actor, a soccer goalkeeper. He also lived in a period of upheaval, just as John did for Italy. John Paul II lived at the juncture of tremendous historical upheaval for Poland. And one of the areas of literature he was very much enthralled with was the romantic literature that romanticized Poland and its destiny from the 19th century and some parts of the early 20th century. So I think one thing that divides them is that John the 23rd was a realist about history and about the world and about the church. John Paul II had that philosopher-poet streak where he looked at things more in terms of destiny. And you can see that destiny is a common theme throughout his pontificate right to the end.
Hagiography or the reflection on a saint's life sometimes can obscure the truth, to embellish one's life so as to highlight a heroic virtue or to emphasize how special this life was. But sometimes hagiography can obscure the truth. Is there some myth or fallacy we need to debunk about the lives of these two men as we take seriously their canonization and the history in which they lived? What about John the 23rd, John? Is there something, a fallacy we need to address?
Well, more or less on the negative side, I mean, the fallacy that one still hears, that he was a well-meaning, naive peasant who didn't know how things worked and didn't see what the consequences would be of some of his actions, which I think is a myth. I think he was, well, none of us ever foresee the consequences of our actions, but he was certainly not naive. He'd had a really wide experience, and as Gerard said, he was a first-rate historian. I mean, a little-known fact about him is that he published 5 volumes of a critical edition of the Visitation of St. Charles Borromeo to the Diocese of Bergamo in the 16th century. He worked on this over the course of 25, 30 years. The last volume published the year before he was elected Pope. And what's interesting for me is that these volumes were published by Leo Olsky, the Jewish publisher in Florence. They were not published by a Catholic press at all, which again is kind of an indication of, I mean, this happened almost by accident, but nonetheless, of what he was like. That would be what I'd say about John the 23rd.
What about John Paul II or John the 23rd, Gerard? A popular myth that we need to address.
Yeah, I guess there are a few for both, but picking up from what John was saying about John the 23rd, as good Pope John was, I almost said must resist the urge to canonize him, but that's too late. And I wouldn't resist that urge. But to canonize everything he did and everything he said, because he knew himself, and the spiritual journal that John's already mentioned, his Journal of a Soul, shows us somebody who struggles with the everyday things that all of us struggle with. There are moments of crisis when his celibacy, is under threat. His period of military service really puts his celibacy and his ministry to the priesthood under threat. There are moments throughout his career where, and I think he knew this himself, where he had a lack of courage. There are certain moments when his journals go silent, and then normally the periods of greatest conflict and upheaval in the church. The modernist crisis, having been quite resolute in standing up for academic freedom for a long time, when he himself comes under investigation, he cowers in the face of the Vatican machinery, and his journal becomes silent for quite a while. So he wasn't perfect, but he knew he wasn't perfect. Constantly throughout his life, even when he was a little boy, he dealt with the sin of pride, and was always bothered by that temptation right to the very end. Even when people first began to talk of him as being Papacy, when he was the Patriarch of Venice, he wanted to silence his family from indulging in such gossip, because that might lead to him getting too inflated within himself. With John Paul II, I think, again, people have tried to lionize everything that he did and everything that he said. And of course, history shows that no human being is perfect in everything that they do and they say. One of the things that John Paul II gets credited with quite often is the collapse of Eastern European state totalitarian communism. And that, I think, really is a myth. He was influential on Eastern Europe, and especially in Poland, and he addressed political realities in many parts of the globe, Latin America included. But when the Berlin Wall came down, it wasn't John Paul II that the people were thinking of first and foremost on the streets of Germany that day. He was very significant in giving sustenance and support and encouragement to the Solidarity trade union movement in Poland. And he also allowed other world leaders to think that perhaps something different might be possible in Eastern Europe. But he wasn't single-handedly responsible. Neither he nor the Vatican during his pontificate expected the USSR to collapse so quickly. So I think that's probably the biggest myth that needs to be put to bed.
I think he was such a strong personality and had such strong positions on a variety of topics that he really opens himself up to a lot of criticism, because there's no doubt where he stood on a lot of controversial issues. I mean, John the 23rd was a much more, I don't want to say passive, but receptive individual. And I think the way he handled the Second Vatican Council, I mean, once he convoked it, if you want to talk about a fault, what Giuseppe Alberigo calls John the 23rd's original sin was putting the preparation for the council in the hands of the heads of the Roman congregations, which kind of delivered the council, the first phase of the council, into the hands of the Curia, Curia is a fine group of people and so forth, but they were now wearing two hats, and their office and their way of proceeding was going to be under criticism. So that was a problem. But once the council, so he let that happen. But once the council met again, he believed in the Holy Spirit being in the council, in the church at large, and was a hands-off policy, except on two instances, which he made two crucial procedural interventions. His hand was almost forced on those, but he made them, and they were excellent interventions. But two different personalities, and so I think he's sort of less obviously open to criticism than John Paul II.
Let's look at two central issues in Vatican II, and let me ask you to consider whether there's continuity, how there's continuity and discontinuity between the two soon-to-be canonized popes. The two issues I will look at are collegiality and interreligious dialogue. We've already touched on interreligious dialogue coming out of that seminal document, Nostra Aetate, which fostered dialogue among the Catholic Church and non-Christian churches, and then parts of another document, Lumen Gentium, which focused on, and another document in the Council, which focused on our relationship with other Christian churches, and then also non-believers, those are not aligned with any one religion. The second issue being collegiality, which is an inside baseball church term, which means the relationship between the Vatican and the local diocese, or the Bishop of Rome and the local bishops. What is this relationship? Is the Pope a first among equals? How do we characterize the leadership, the governance of the Supreme Pontiff in relationship to the local bishop or the local diocese? So, Gerard, can we look at both of those issues? So interreligious dialogue and collegiality, continuity, discontinuity.
Yes, there's a bit of both in relation to both of the popes who are going to be canonized and in relation to Vatican II. Both of them were passionate about the importance of interfaith dialogue, and John the 23rd made it possible for John Paul II to be passionate about interreligious dialogue, because he set in motion the things that led to the teachings at Vatican II, the shift in theological focus. He set up the Secretariat for Christian Unity as well, and then reached out to the Jewish peoples in a very, very open way. And it was his own life and his own postings and his own history that taught John the 23rd this. He was posted to Turkey, Eastern Europe. He spent time there. He had to live dialogue. During the Second World War, he was the go-between for many sides in Istanbul, between the Germans, between the British, the Americans, the Greeks, the Muslims, as well as the Christians, the Orthodox, as well as the Catholics. He knew the importance of dialogue and how important it was to see the entire human race as one global family. And so he put into place the conditions for the possibility of the teachings of Vatican II on these particular issues. And that was revolutionary in the history of the Church. If you compare the Council of Florence, what it says about Judaism and Jewish people, with Vatican II, there is no continuity. It's a volte-face. It's a complete about-turn. Now, John Paul II was passionate also about ecumenical and interfaith dialogue. However, he also put into place the conditions for the possibility of roadblocks being put in the way of progress in both those areas. And he even had disputes with some of his own curial staff. Joseph Ratzinger, when he was prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, really disagreed with John Paul II on the Assisi World Day of Prayer, the first one, which took place in the 1980s, and said in a German newspaper that this is not the way it should be done, and it never was done quite that way henceforth. So his own centralizing tendencies within the church also stood in the way of some of his own intentions to increase ecumenical dialogue and to increase interfaith dialogue. So he has both continuity and discontinuity there. With regards to collegiality, of course, well, again, John the 23rd, excuse me, the keen historian that he was, wherever he went, he would read up on the history of the church in that place, and he would delve into the history of councils and synods. And he had a good teacher, his bishop in Bergamo, taught him the importance of synodality and therefore of collegiality. And when he became Pope, it wasn't just the Second Vatican Council he called, he also announced a synod for Rome, which was a groundbreaking move. No bishop of Rome had fought to do that before. Unfortunately, it wasn't such quite a monumental success as Vatican II, but he really firmly believed in taking soundings, in having dialogue throughout the local church. John Paul II, when he became Pope, his very first address to the world, he announced the importance of collegiality in that, and announced his intentions to bring Vatican II to full fruition. He didn't do that. In fact, under his pontificate, many steps were put in place which effectively neutered the progress on collegiality among bishops that was made at Vatican II. Now, some of the Vatican II documents themselves speak with a forked tongue on the issue of collegiality. So that was partly a problem the Council Fathers and Paul VI in particular left the future church to deal with. But in the end, John Paul II came down on one side, and that side was away from effective collegiality and more towards centralization. And in the end, you know, we with Apostolos Suos, a document that John Paul II released, it even was denying the teaching mandate that national and regional episcopal conferences actually have. And you see it under Pope Francis, the pendulum has swung back the other way again.
Yeah, one thing about John the 23rd that's important. I mean, collegiality was not on the agenda as such during his pontificate. I mean, it was talked about in that first period of the council, but then he died, and collegiality didn't really become the lightning rod issue of the council till after he was dead. So to talk about his relationship to collegiality is a little bit anachronistic. However, as Gerard said, what I think is really important about John the 23rd is his understanding of the role of local councils and synods in the history of the church. And he saw this in action, especially with Charles Borromeo, who had, 11, I think, diocesan synods and 5 or 7 provincial synods in a relatively short episcopacy. So this is the seed, really, for what collegiality is all about. So collegiality is when the bishops are collected together, they have, with the pontiff, a responsibility for the whole church. So they're not just responsible for their diocese, but they have responsibility for the whole church. So John the 23rd saw this dimly, through a glass darkly. He saw, as Gerard said, he saw the history of the church, how this was. I mean, for me, the innovation in the church is the strong emphasis on papal primacy, because really, into the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, the church was basically governed through local synods. And this is where things happened. The popes intervened only as a judge, final arbiter.
So. Let's imagine 100 years from now, there's a gathering of the Georgetown community reflecting on these two popes, soon to be saints. If you can try this experiment, 100 years from now, with the perspective that history and provides us, looking back, do you think, what achievement would be ascribed to each of these popes? What principal achievement, success would be ascribed to them? And with the perspective of history, 100 years from now, what might be their failing or their major piece of unfinished business? Gerard, do you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, I think John the 23rd is easier in both respects, really, to identify. I think history will judge him to have opened up the church to the world in a positive sense, a two-way dialogue with the world, to commit the church unfailingly to human rights, to dialogue among all peoples, and committing the church to reform of itself. Vatican II will stand the test of history as one of the most significant general councils of the Roman Catholic Church. And history will never dilute or water down what John did. And let's be honest, it was a relatively short pontificate, but it was a pontificate that really changed the church and the world forevermore. And John really opened up those channels of dialogue that made so much more possible. What were his failings? Well, not a failing for him, but he died too soon. It's a regret we can have. That also changed the direction of the council. John's focus, his key priority, was the church looking outwards to the world. Paul VI didn't negate that or neuter it, but he saw as a key priority trying to deal with the real issues within the church to begin with. And so the Second Vatican Council became more focused ad intra than ad extra until the very end, and the final debates about Gaudium et Spes at the council there. John also wanted to change the Vatican machinery. He was not a pope of the Curia, and he wasn't a pope for the Curia, and he knew the Curia would need to change, but he didn't really grasp that nettle enough, and he left in place really the structures and the people that would slowly but surely hold back Vatican II from going in the direction that the majority of the fathers wished it to go. So you could say that's a bit of a failing in and of itself. With John Paul II, what will history judge him in 100 years' time to have achieved? Again, this is a long pontificate, the second longest in history. So there's a great deal for historians to mull over. But perhaps his commitment to social justice, and also he continued some of the legacy for interfaith and ecumenical dialogue. Mixed messages come out from about the midpoint of his pontificate onwards with regards to certain curial departments on that. But also history will also judge that pontificate in a more critical fashion as well. He presided over a period of unprecedented centralization of the church. And this centralization brought about a lot of division and polarization within the church. The way in which the church looks at moral and social issues was transformed again to become a less context-specific and attentive way of looking at some of these issues. It will be seen as a period when people began to walk away from the church, and there were serious disagreements between the church and people of other churches, people of other faiths, and people of no faith. So history will have a lot more critical, perhaps, and especially positive to say about John Paul II in 100 years. John the 23rd will primarily be judged in the constructive light of his achievements with Vatican II and the changes he did implement within the church.
As a historian, I mean, of course, I always tell people, I'm not a prophet, I don't do this, but I'm going to do it now. I'll look ahead 100 years. If we look at general histories in which the papacy plays a role, John the 23rd will be remembered for one thing. He convoked the Second Vatican Council, and this was a big event in the history of the Catholic Church and world history. I think in that scenario, John Paul II will be forgotten. I don't think there'll be anything special to remember him by. Now, then if you focus, if someone writes a history of the papacy, then it's a different story altogether, and we get into the various issues that you were talking about. But no doubt about it, John the 23rd's convoking of the council was a landmark, for better or for worse, however you want to look at it, was absolutely a landmark for the Catholic Church, and that will be remembered 100 years from now. Another thing about the Curia and John the 23rd, the the Curia was a kind of a personal issue for John the 23rd, but it wasn't really a public church issue, really almost until he died. And that's when, during that first period of the council, that's when this animus against the Curia and the feeling that the Curia was manipulating the council, trying to ram through its own ideas in the council, that's when this issue of the Curia really became critical. It's Paul VI then who decided not to change anything, even keep the same people in place. What John the 23rd would have done is another question. I mean, he was not very good at that. He was not good at confrontation.
No.
Whereas John Paul II was very good at confrontation.
In fact, John the 23rd tended to avoid confrontation whenever he could. But he could be firm when he had to. One of my favourite stories about him is there were two curial cardinals who felt that they had jobs for life, and he wanted to move them on. They'd reached a noble age, and he wanted to bring in some younger and fresh blood into the Curia. And despite repeated requests from the Pope himself, these two cardinals were not budging. They were quite happy in their office, and they were going to continue in it. So John the 23rd took the step of announcing his gratitude to them in the pages of L'Osservatore Romano for having voluntarily resigned their office. And the two cardinals first heard about this when they were reading L'Osservatore Romano over their breakfast the following week. So he could take people on, and he did take some of the bishops on in Venice as well, who were trying to influence the political persuasion of some of the people of Venice. But he much more preferred to be engaging in dialogue. You know, the key thing for John was there's a lot more that we have in common than what divides us, and that marked his pontificate.
One final question before we invite questions from our audience here in Riggs Library. Francis's name has already been invoked. So Francis was the one who chose to canonize both of these, his predecessors, together in an astute move in the eyes of many. And so there'll be a great celebration on Sunday in Rome. Can we talk about continuity and discontinuity between Francis and either or both John the 23rd and John Paul II, whether in style or substance or both? John, you want to take a shot at that first?
Well, that's an easy one. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that there's great continuity between the style and the substance and the priorities of Francis and John the 23rd. I mean, John Paul II was very good on dialogue with the Muslims and with the Jews and so forth. But he didn't do what Francis did when he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires. Do a public, ongoing, sit-down dialogue with Rabbi Skorka. That's unheard of. So dialogue is, for Francis, the Vatican Council, its collegiality, interreligious dialogue, peace on earth, these are simply givens. Whereas I really feel that with Paul VI and John Paul II and Benedict XVI, they were still fighting the battles of the council. They were still too involved in the council. They was still fighting those battles. Francis is not. It's a given. And so these great movements of the council, he just takes as the air he breathes. So I think he's obviously, for me, much more in continuity with John the 23rd than he is with John Paul II.
Yeah, I'd obviously agree with John. There is something they share in common. They both have all three popes have a complete commitment to social justice and to not just helping the poor, but changing the societal structures that make the poor poor. And all three were totally uncompromising in what they say about the need for that. And it's the Church's duty to do that. And they're in continuity with the Church's own tradition across a long period of history in doing that. And all three were passionately committed to interchurch, interfaith dialogue, and dialogue between Christians and people of no particular faith. But John is completely right. when Cardinal Bergoglio was elected Pope Francis, the Italian media started picking up and homing in on his ears and saying, he's got the ears of Papa Giovanni. He's got the ears of John the 23rd. And of course, in a literal sense, they were saying that. But actually, he's also a good listener, like John the 23rd. And he went about with gusto this year of his pontificate. He's gone about his business as Pope, emulating a lot of the style and trends of John the 23rd. He will take soundings further afield. He will cut through the pomp and the ceremony. So he's not living in the papal apartment, he's living in the hostel of St. Martha. John the 23rd, when he became Pope, it had been for a long time tradition that the Pope would dine alone. And for a person who came from an enormous family in the mountains of Italy, this must have been torture. So one day he announced to the papal household, he said, I've done a careful study of the doctrines of the church and of the sayings of my predecessors and of Scripture, and I find no justification for why the Pope should have to dine alone. Therefore, I am ceasing this tradition, and forthwith I will always dine with other people. And this used to make him often quite late for some of his audiences, but he sort of need to cut through the swathe, and Francis is the same. Tradition isn't there for its own sake, it's there to serve the church community. What they both fundamentally share in common is that commitment to charity in all things, that what unites us is more important than what divides us. And also they relativize both John the 23rd in his opening address to the council and other places, and Francis in his recent document from last November, Evangelii Gaudium, they relativized doctrinal disputes. John the 23rd came from the mountain region, and he said, look, doctrinal disputes are like the mountain mist. Before it's mid-morning, they've disappeared, and they don't seem so important anymore. What's really important is putting the gospel into practice. Francis is saying the same, and they both have a reforming zeal. Francis announces in that document, Evangelii Gaudium, his specific intention to decentralize the church. And John, slowly but surely, wanted to try and allow for there to be some decentralization as well. Now, in terms of continuity and discontinuity, no one knows if this story is true. We all perhaps wish it was, but when John the 23rd made a younger man a new bishop once, the younger man was a bit fearful that he couldn't live up to the job, and he asked John the 23rd for some advice. And John the 23rd said, just do what I always do the complete opposite of your predecessor. So I don't know if Francis is taking that on board, but you see parallel after parallel between Francis and John the 23rd.
One thing about, just a little addendum here. One thing John the 23rd did when he became Pope was, for the first time now, after the pontificate of Pius XII, began to gather the heads of the Roman congregations together and for discussion instead of meeting them one by one. And so a kind of a little mini collegiality within the papal apartment itself. So Francis is doing the same sort of thing.
Well, good. Thank you both. I invite questions from our audience, if you would. Just comments, feedback. We have a microphone. If you just stand and please identify yourself.
Oh, hi. My name is George Norrie, class of 55, Foreign Service. Father, you mentioned John Paul II may not be remembered for anything, but didn't he bring down communism along with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan? Wouldn't that be an outstanding achievement of a lifetime?
Well, I think Gerard tried to deal with that. He was a factor there, but communism was crumbling from within at the time. So that's something that he did, and yes, that's one of the things. But as I say, in the big history of the 20th century, he's one figure among many, whereas Second Vatican Council was unique. So what would you say to that?
I'd agree. I think all history demonstrates, whatever period of history you go to, a corrupt empire will always rot from within. And the Soviet Union rotted from within. They overstretched themselves in trying to maintain the Cold War, in trying to push forward with the political ideology of the time. And it couldn't go on for much longer. If you want to credit one particular person with being more decisive than anything else in the downfall of that particular system, then Mikhail Gorbachev is the only person who really deserves credit. Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, John Paul II, I know a lot of people would like to credit them with bringing this down, and they were factors in this. But I don't think the speeches from people such as Thatcher and Reagan really impacted the internal life of the Soviet Union very much at all. I think it was the internal structures. And for sure, John Paul II, as I mentioned earlier, did inspire people in Eastern Europe, and particularly in Poland. There's another stroke of discontinuity there, because he was very against clergy and religious being involved in politics in Latin America. But he was very much in favor of it in Poland. So liberation theology of a Latin American brand was to be suspect and questioned, but liberation theology of a Polish kind was to be encouraged and resourced. So there's another little moment of discontinuity there as well.
Well, his first visit to Poland after he was Pope was a non-political apostolic visit. But there was no political, non-political visit that ever took place.
Thank you. Other questions? John Borelli.
Thank you very much, John Borelli. I wonder, too, if there's a parallel among John the 23rd and John Paul II and Francis in the surprise factor. When Paul VI was elected, we pretty much knew who we were getting and what he was going to do. And I think the same was true of Benedict XVI, and it's probably true of Pius XII. But John the 23rd's closest friends, like Lambert Baudouin, would have known about, in fact, he predicted he'd be elected and he'd call a council, but he stands out as a very close, intimate friend. But most didn't, there was a surprise factor with what John the 23rd turned out doing. And the same thing to some extent with Francis. I think he was a surprise factor. And to some extent, I think John Paul II. And I'm talking about the electors themselves. The very people that elected him were probably surprised by all three in a sort of parallel fashion. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, with John the 23rd, of course, the College of Cardinals had been allowed to shrink to, I think, about under 50 members at that time. Nonetheless, the papal tailors prepared 25 cassocks for papabili. They had no idea which one of those 25 might be elected. And Roncalli was elected on the 12th ballot. And they didn't have a cassock to fit him. He was too fat. So they had to cut it and stitch it together at the last minute so he could do it. So complete surprise, and he was a transitional pope. Nobody expected him to do much, and started off. With John Paul II, yes, there were George Williams, who taught church history at Harvard Divinity School. He predicted his election. He's the only person that I know who did that. And again, people didn't know how to pronounce his name, his family name, when he was elected. And then the same thing, of course, with Francis. So, yes, big surprise factor. And they were unknowns, so nobody had any idea what to expect from them.
I'd agree. I'd say yes and no. I mean, there are stories surrounding any conclave, and you pay your money and you take your choice, and there's stories about the French bishops switching, to elect John the 23rd in the end. But one other interesting parallel with Francis, and we should remember as well that John the 23rd, Angelo Roncalli was one of the younger cardinals despite his age, because Pius XII hadn't kept up appointing cardinals. John the 23rd soon changed that. But shortly before he was elected, the cardinals, small in number as they were, got together and said, what sort of pope does the church today need? And they drew up a sort of job description for the person they should elect. And there were very few people among their limited number who could tick all the boxes. They wanted a pope who would be more open, more engaged with the world, more interested in dialogue, more up to date with trying to make the church relevant in today's world and putting the gospel into practice in that relevant way. It seems there would have been very few people other than Angelo Roncalli with a CV that would have actually matched that job description. Fast forward to 2013, and you also have the cardinals pre-conclave, so it included, thankfully, many of the electors who were over the age of 80, who couldn't cast a vote, but who were still in the College of Cardinals. They met in the hall of Pope Paul VI in the Vatican, and they also said, what sort of pope does today's world need? And they came up with a job description, which again very much matches the CV of Jorge Bergoglio. Now, the other thing in common is that in many ways you could see the job description both in 1958 and in 2013 as really showing a lack of continuity with the previous popes. So the pope that was desirable in 1958 was a very different pope in terms of character to Pius XII. And the pope that the cardinals in 2013 said they needed was of a very different character to Benedict XVI.
Yeah, I think that's very true. But again, come back to the fact that John the 23rd, Roncalli was not elected until the 12th ballot. So obviously, this was not they didn't put 2 + 2 together and get 4 right away.
Other questions? Yes, Michelle.
Hi, Michelle Daly, college class 2014. So you mentioned Benedict, and that was actually going to be my question. So we're talking about continuity in the modern papacy, and we've kind of been ignoring the fact that we now have a retired pope and our current pope. So I was wondering, A, what do you think, using your 100-year question, Benedict will be looked at in 100 years, and then also how he fits in or doesn't fit in with this continuity that we've been talking about?
You want to take a...
Well, John's already liberated historians from writing too much about John Paul II in 100 years. I think Benedict XVI's papacy will not feature very prominently in histories in 100 years because there wasn't much that was achieved during that papacy. It will feature in discussions, it will feature in chapters. Some of the controversial issues will be mentioned, the Regensburg Address where Muslims were offended, the handling of the abuse crisis, which straddles both John Paul II's and Benedict XVI's papacy. But in terms of achievements, it's not going to be one of those papacies that will really warrant much commentary at all. Now, whether people might be upset about that because they remember him as a church leader and as a pope, and he's still there, as the Pope Emeritus. But that's the situation. He's got a fairly unique situation. It's not the first time in history where there's been more than one pope alive, but it's the first one in modern times. It's interesting that when Pope Francis was elected, one of the first things he asked the crowd to do was to pray for his predecessor. But he didn't call him the Pope Emeritus, he called him the Bishop Emeritus. And then he described himself as Bishop of Rome. And that was a very significant thing. It was almost to say, we draw a line under the achievements of our predecessor and we honour him. But the church is now moving on and there are different questions to be tackled. And so I don't think Benedict will go down in history as one of the great popes.
I agree with that. But again, come back with, we're talking 100 years from now. History has a very leveling tendency. So these popes, they're among probably by that time, close to 300 popes if all goes well. So 1 or 2 will stand out, but the others will be forgotten, except somebody who's writing a history of the papacy. Then some of these details will be there. But I think, again, with poor Benedict XVI, what he'll be remembered for is not anything that he was responsible for, but will be the sexual abuse crisis. This is a big issue in the Catholic Church, so this was going on while he was Pope, of course, also with John Paul II. So,
Question? Yes. John?
Hi, John Collins, undergraduate, and I'm studying the Council of Trent and Vatican II with Father O'Malley.
beware of him.
So Pope John XXIII goes to Regina Coeli Prison and the Children's Hospital, and there goes the end of the prisoner of the Vatican and leaving the Vatican and entering the world outside. Then Paul VI continuity goes to the Holy Land, India, the UN, and then everybody follows that. And Pope Benedict, he went to Yankee Stadium, very well received. So was Pope John XXIII the model for that, leaving the Vatican and entering the world outside? And if he didn't do it, would Paul VI been the first one to do it, or was Pope John 23 the model for that?
Well, John the 23 was the beginning of the change, because what he did right before the Vatican Council, he made a pilgrimage to Assisi and Loreto to pray for the council. So that's the first time since 1870 that a pope had left the confines of the Vatican, Castel Gandolfo, well, the city of Rome, really, for anything. So, and then what he did too was in 1961, it was the 100th anniversary of Italian unification, and he was invited and accepted an invitation to the Quirinal Palace, the old papal residence in the city of Rome, which was the residence now of the President of the Republic. And this was, again, a break with this prisoner of the Vatican bit and a reconciliation with what had happened in 1860, 1870 that caused the Pope Pius IX to consider himself a prisoner of the Vatican. So there was the wedge there. But the spectacular change was Paul VI going to the Holy Land in January of 1964. I mean, that was the real breakthrough. And then his visit to India, and then his visit to the UN. So with that, it was over.
Yeah, I'd agree. John the 23rd didn't actually travel so widely himself, but actually the world came to him. That was very significant. A lot of people, world leaders and religious leaders from all over the world came to visit in a rapid succession. Pope John the 23rd. Yeah, Archbishop of Canterbury, the first time since the Reformation in the 16th century. So John's vision and outlook for the church opened up those doors and made it possible for his successors to travel the world in a much more engaged fashion. And Paul VI did do very significant things and became known as the Pilgrim Pope. And then, of course, John Paul II went on something like, was it 104 different trips outside of Italy to multiple countries all around the world, including to countries where Christians were in a minority. But also, of course, technology and travel have changed and made that a little more possible. The papacy has evolved in the modern era. And for John the 23rd, really, he drew a line under the hostilities between the Italian state and the Vatican, which had existed since the 19th century. And he was very keen to do that, and that was one of his priorities to do that. Because he was also a proud Italian, he also wanted this rift between the two great loves of his life, his country and his church, to be healed. But above all else, he opened up the church to the world and made that possible for the Bishop of Rome to become a world citizen. And, you know, that night of the opening of the council where he blesses the crowd and the whole world is watching, and he tells the crowd assembled to go home and gather their children and give them a hug from the Pope. He became the sort of father of the human family that night. Everybody looked to this man from around the globe, be they communist leaders in Russia, be they people of other faiths in different parts of the world. He had this charm which opened doors and built bridges. And of course the Pope is the pontiff. He's supposed to be a bridge builder, and he really was a bridge builder par excellence.
I think that one way to look at these two pontificates is what I would call sort of implicit models of the church that were operative in these pontificates. And for John the 23rd, I take a line from his address opening the council when he said that the council should show the church to be the loving mother of all, benign, patient, full of mercy and goodness. Now the council took that up, and I think you can look at the council as trying to work out that model of the church. John Paul II certainly believed in that model, but it was more of a citadel. It was a city to stand firm against the world, the flesh, and the devil, and also to be a reconciler and so forth. But so I think these are two models, and they're both legitimate. But I think they kind of hit off some of the deep realities of the two pontificates.
We have time for one last question. Yes, in the front.
Well, my name is Mary Ann Lee Post.
That microphone.
Oh, sure. Educated by the Sisters of Charity of the Blessed Virgin Mary and the Vincentians. I have a doctorate in education, and I'm the mother of 7 children, including 6 daughters. They are waiting with bated breath to see what Pope Francis's leadership will be on the role of women in the church and dealing with the pedophilia crisis.
So
That's a statement.
So I think we've touched on the. Do you want to maybe speak about those popes' attitudes with regard to women?
Yes.
You take that one.
I think, historians, as John would tell you, have to be careful about psychoanalyzing historical figures. But John Paul II lost his mother at a young age, had a baby sister who also died, and his father actually died when he was quite young too. So some people have claimed that he had an idealized vision of women, and hence his devotion to the Virgin Mary. Whether or not that's true, his understanding of women was found wanting in many respects, because although many of the documents he issued would praise women and their ministry within the church, at the same time some of the policies and other statements he was making demeaned and restricted the role of women within the church, and not just women, laity in general. So for the papacy of John Paul II has been very problematic for many women within the church. John the 23rd, of course, was in a different era and didn't open up so many opportunities for women within the church, but he did value and facilitate opportunities in some quarters of the church for women. And he also eventually, he said in train, but it didn't happen until after he died, that there would be women observers at the Second Vatican Council. Without John being Pope, I don't think that would have ever been possible. So, but the public statements of John Paul II, really, that's part of his negative legacy as well. Feminist theologians and women who've served the church as religious and as lay people find it very hard to reconcile some of the positive statements about women and their role in the church with some of the actual treatment of women within the church. Pope Francis at the moment is giving mixed messages, and this is one of the areas where people wish he would come down on one side or the other. Pope Paul VI, ultimately, I think John might agree, has not gone down as such a great historical papacy because he tried to live up to his name too much. He tried to be all things to all people within the church and ended up pleasing nobody satisfactorily. Now, Francis at the moment is saying about how important it is to get women into positions of the key decision-making areas of the church and how valuable their particular experiences and insights are. He is appointing some women to various bodies as well. The recent body to look at the abuse crisis, for example, Mary Keenan, for example, from Ireland, a fantastic person, one of the abuse survivors, who kept battling against the cover-up of abuse in Ireland when the bishops repeatedly ignored her. She's now part of the Vatican body on that.
She's the head of it, isn't she?
I don't think she's appointed head as yet.
I thought she was.
And he's just appointed a new head of the Pontifical Academy for Social Sciences, a British sociologist who's currently working in Switzerland. But what we're hearing in a lot of parts of the world is people need to hear more. What does he mean when he speaks about the need to honour women and put them into positions of authority within the church? Does this mean what it seems to say? And so there's mixed messages there for now, but...
Yeah, I think that he has said, that he has a lot to learn on this issue. So he knows it's an issue, and he knows he has a lot to learn. So I guess I'm optimistic about him because he can't, once he gets his mind made up and thinks it's the right thing to do, he will move. But I don't think we should make that a litmus test of the pontificate. I mean, it's one important issue among a number of important issues. And I think when he chose his name, he gave a sort of the first hint of what his priorities were. Why Francis of Assisi? For peace, for the poor, and for the environment. And these are big, big, big world issues. This issue of women is also a big issue, but I think it is not yet sort of percolated up to that kind of a status in his agenda.
Well, thank you both, Professor Mannion and Professor O'Malley, for preparing us for Sunday's most amazing celebration, where we will have this Francis honoring on behalf of the Church, Popes John the 23rd and John Paul II. I think it's always good to remind ourselves that as we canonize men and women as saints in the Church, we are not acclaiming them as perfect. And I think it's a very, consoling reminder to all of us that in our lives of faith, we strive to live lives of faith, hope, and love, knowing that even for popes made saints, they struggle with greatness and they struggle with their own limitation. And that example should be consoling to all of us as we honor their lives of heroic virtue and what they've contributed to the Church and to the world as human beings and as leaders in the Church. I'm reminded as we talk a lot about saints, what Thomas Merton reminded us about sainthood. The point of sainthood is not for us to be someone else, however admirable they are, like Pope John the 23rd or Pope John Paul II. But the call to sainthood is for us to be the person that God made us to be, each in our own way. So let us, in a sense, honor Sunday's celebrations in the best way fitting, which is to find each in our own way how God is calling us, you and me, to be saints. So thank you to both of you. Thank you to our audience. We will continue our conversation with some refreshments in the presence room. Thank you.